I'm Noor Mohammed, and welcome to another episode of Hajj Stories. Today, I'm speaking with author and activist Moazzam Begg. So, thank you for sitting down with us, Moazzam. So, who were you before you went to Hajj?
Before going to Hajj, which was in 1997, I was a young man. Had not too long before that, a couple of years before that, been married. I had a child who went on with me to the Hajj also. And I was rediscovering my identity. And part of my rediscovery of that identity was being a Muslim who practices religion based upon the normative understanding of Islam, of which Hajj was an integral part, one of the 5 pillars, of course. And it was dependent on man istata'a ilayhi sabila, on those who are able to do so. And the ability came for me both financially and in the terms of travel in 1997.
So, you said you had a kid with you when you went. Mm-hmm. So, what led you to do your first Hajj, and how difficult was it doing Hajj with a kid?
I think things were quite different back in those days. You had more freedom to be able to do something without, say, a Hajj tour operator. So I had connections with a friend of mine who was actually Palestinian, who lived in Mecca. And he said, you can go there and stay with my brother, and you can perform all the rites of Hajj without having to be part of a company. My brother can show you all the rites. And so in a sense, I made that connection, but also the idea of going for Hajj, for me, as somebody who'd been, up until my mid-20s, I wasn't really a practicing Muslim. I'd been a cultural Muslim in a sense. I had been part of a street gang that fought neo-Nazis on the streets of Birmingham. And part of that identity was rediscovering myself, not just on a kind of a political sense of, being politically connected to what's happening to the Muslims in Bosnia, in Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, the first invasion was taking place, but also trying to find a way to spiritually cleanse myself of all the past that I'd been involved in. And I understood that part of my preparation would be, if I could, to go for the Hajj, and that Allah Azza wa Jal would forgive my sins and return me as if I was a newborn child. And what could there have been that, as far as I understood, than to do Hajj. So I was very prepared and very looking forward to it. Like most people, I read about it, I learned, I went to talks and conferences, read books, and prepared myself in the best possible way, alongside my wife.
So along with the different rituals in Hajj, how did you feel spiritually going and doing those different rituals?
Most people talk about seeing the Kaaba for the very first time. I had gone for Umrah as a child, as a young teenager before, so I had been there. I'd experienced at least the Umrah part of it. Hajj was quite different, and of course the large numbers of people there, also being responsible for my wife, who herself was at that time expecting, and our first child, my daughter, who was less than a year old at the time. So I had plenty of people telling me, don't go with your daughter because there's too many risks of getting hurt in stampedes and so forth, and just the sheer number of people. But then I spoke to other people who said, no, you have to have reliance on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. After all, children are part of life. And there's, in the early days, they wouldn't make a differentiation between children and families. No, people would do things out of family. And I saw other family members taking kids and stuff there, though it was difficult, because often I'd have to pick up my daughter and do the tawaf with her. And the tawaf wouldn't be just right around the Kaaba, it would be around the vicinity of the Kaaba because of the numbers of people there. So of course it was hard, it was difficult. There was one occasion where I literally, on the day of Safa and Marwa, I lost my wife. I didn't know where she was. And because that huge number of people there, I didn't know even where to start. I said to her that we'll meet at this particular place after Safa and Marwa, and she wasn't there. And I spent the entire day, from Fajr until past Isha, looking for her, and I couldn't find her. I went to the hospitals, I went to the morgue, I went to police stations, I could not find her. This was not the day of mobile phones, the time of mobile phones, so it was very, very difficult. Eventually, I got a call from the place where I was staying, saying that your wife has called and that she's at this Babila. I don't remember which entrance it was, but they said she's there. She's next to a guard. She's in tears. She's not been able to find you. That was just one of the experiences of the many experiences I had in Hajj.
So what happened? How did she get lost?
What had happened is I lay down to rest after Fajr. She went to do Safa and Marwa, which she thought she'd just, take advantage of the time. But because of the numbers of people that were there, she simply couldn't find where I was afterwards. And I'd gone looking for her, she was looking for me, and the whole day went by just like that.
Oh, subhanAllah. So you said you've already had some connections out there, but you've also out there with different communities and different people from different countries. How did it feel performing Hajj with these different people?
I mean, this is one of the beauties of Islam. It is really, if you talk about, often we talk about Britain or other places in the West, London, for example, a great melting pot. Well, you've not seen a melting pot until you've been to Mecca and Medina in Hajj time, because that literally is people from all over the world in their millions descending upon this place. And the one thing that connects them, because there's people who are non-Arabs, Turks, Iranians, Pakistanis, Indonesians, and everybody from the Arab world, they've all got different forms of communication. But everybody's Assalamu alaikum. Everybody knows when the Imam says Allahu Akbar, doesn't matter what language you speak, your hands go up and you tie them above your chest. And that, nobody's trained them, nobody's given them any kind of military training to precisionally move like this and to do all of the rites. And yet they're doing this in unison. And that is because of their faith. And you don't feel a connection to any other human being in the way that you do in Hajj, because you're engaged in those same rites of Hajj. And, Hajj has its difficulties. It's much easier now than it was at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. But still, Hajj was told that this is the jihad of the women. So it is a struggle by its necessity, by its nature.
You said that you had a less than 1-year-old kid at the time and your wife was expecting. Mm-hmm. So mentally going into Hajj, how did you prepare yourself and how did you physically prepare yourself for this?
Well, I knew that I would be going to stay with people who would be guiding me and advising me from local Palestinians. My wife at the time was also Palestinian, so it was kind of a connection also that existed. But there's, I wouldn't be truthful if I wasn't a little bit scared. And that fear almost manifested into terrible reality, because this was the year 1997, when in Mina, where we were, a fire broke out. And this fire, some say it started because of people cooking, others say because of the heat and somebody burnt some object. I don't know what it was, but I remember when we were praying, this was Salat, when you're praying Salat al-Dhuhr, that ashes, I could see the ashes, which seemed so strange in the heat of midday in Arabia, that these ashes are falling, and they started to fall on our heads. And this was the ashes from the tents that were on fire. And so I had to pick up my daughter and my wife, grab her hand, hold the daughter in the other hand, and a bag over my shoulder, and run. Because there were other people running through, shouting, screaming. And we had to run in the intense heat of the midday. And we didn't have any water. We'd left it all behind. And crowds were gathering. One crowd ran up to a mountain, and we went with them and took shelter, because we were told that the flames, and we could see the flames coming. I could see the helicopters flying over Mina, and almost in futility trying to drop, water balloons over the fire to stop it. We descended from the mountain and still walking through. I'm desperate to look for water. My daughter is of all, she's very thirsty, and it's almost changing color. And people are fighting for water. There's vehicles going around that are trying to pass water out. But everywhere you go, there's a massive queue. And I'm in Ihram. I don't want to fight anyone for anything. So I try to do the good thing, which is just to not budge and shove and barge. But everybody else is. So eventually I went past this tent where there's an old woman, and she seems to have some water with her. So I pleaded with her, could I get some water from her, for my daughter? And she did. She filled a little flask and gave it to me, a little bottle. But that was a thing that I'll never forget. I didn't know the numbers of people that had died at that time, but I read afterwards that it was around 1,000 to 1,500 people were killed.
So when this fire broke out, how did your daughter feel? Because seeing this, you must have been horrified, and as well as your wife.
Well, as a child, as a baby almost, you don't really notice, you don't understand what any of that stuff is. Perhaps she sensed the panic in me in picking her up and running. But really, it was nothing other than just being thirsty. And you could see the thirst on her face and the heat. As I was saying, her color changing. I was thirsty. I was desperate to drink something, so I could only imagine how she was. But just as much as there were people pushing and shoving out of desperation, there were decent people there who I could see very clearly, if they had the opportunity, they would assist with whatever little they had. And for me, it was just that woman giving me some of her little bit of water.
How were you able to continue a Hajj after such a devastation?
In Hajj, almost every year, there's some kind of stampede, either whether it's around the stoning of the Jamarat or and in Mina and other places. There are always terrible accidents that take place when such a mass number of people gather together. It's almost, it's a miracle that if there's ever a year when that doesn't happen. So I understood, I was prepared for some kind of hardships, but of course, nothing prepares you for a test when you're in the midst of it. And alhamdulillah, I didn't get tested really badly at all, but I know others did terribly. And in the end, I knew that I could still go back to the flat where I was staying at, where some of these guys were, literally sleeping in tents or sleeping on the floor and with the sky as their cover.
So in this Hajj, was there anything in particular that stood out to you?
Other than having faced the fire and the deaths, it was just a sense of achievement that on the day, particularly of the day of Arafah, and then the day of slaughtering the sheep and getting my hair shaved and stoning the Jamarat. I think stoning the Jamarat for me was, as for a lot of people, was an achievement in itself, because we went extra early to make sure we avoid the crowds. I did see people throwing slippers and other things, really taking it out on something that's supposed to be kind of, ritualistic rather than actually, that's not really a shaitan standing there. But getting through that, I think, was important. But I've always felt that Hajj, and this is an important one, the Prophet ﷺ did Hajj only once ever in his life. He did 3 umrahs. One of those umrahs was consequential to his Hajj. And he took part in 28 military expeditions to defend Islam. And if I compare it now, every year, millions upon millions of people will do the Hajj, while literally next door up north, Muslims are getting wiped out. And I can't balance that in my head. I cannot balance it. I cannot see how millions will take part in something that the Prophet ﷺ did once in his life, but will not, even with their voices, come to the defense of the Muslims who are getting genocided.
So coming out of this Hajj, how did you feel spiritually now?
I felt that I could have fulfilled an obligation, but I don't need to do it again. And that's what I feel like even now. When I hear people go regularly for Hajj, regularly for Umrah, I can't understand how they can do that when the Prophet ﷺ did it once, and the Sunnah is to do it once, and the fasting and so forth. But they tried their best, even to the point at which some freed slaves, eventually when they went back to West Africa, who managed to get their freedom, one of the things they did was to go to Hajj. So they connected, they understood that part of the completion of their faith as Muslims was to do Hajj, even though they'd been slaves held by the Americans. So I found that extremely inspiring. And that somebody that's so poor, that's gone through so much trauma, has gone for Hajj. And indeed, it's really important that I say this, though I'm not able to go to Hajj. I can't go. I've applied to get a visa and it's been constantly rejected. But I have several friends who were held with me, imprisoned and tortured and so forth. And they have returned and gone for Hajj. And they've done it almost as one of those things that they wanted to do immediately after being returned to freedom. And they have done so and fulfilled that part that makes them complete as Muslims.
Your time in Guantanamo, what helped you through that time, if anything?
Of course, my faith was extremely important. I had memorized different verses of the Quran. I read different surahs from the Quran that I found were particularly relevant to me in my situation. The story of Yusuf alayhi salam is often quoted by many prisoners as one that they make reference to. But I'd say the whole Quran itself. I memorized Surah Al-Baqarah, which is something I struggled to do as a free man. I memorized it in prison. And so I have always felt that that time in prison, or imprisoned unjustly. Had I been in prison for a crime, I'd say that, well, that I did, so I deserve it. But when it's unjust, you know that the reward is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you already feel that Allah has accepted, inshallah, what you did, and that it's placed on your balance of good deeds in the hereafter. And I wouldn't trade that experience for anything. I thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deeply for allowing me to go through that.
How were you able to memorize the surah? Because I don't imagine they just hand out Qurans in Guantanamo.
Well, in the beginning they did, but the way they did it was in a way in which you did not want the Quran. So they would pick it up or throw it in the air and drop kick it to you. They would rip its pages, throw it into a bucket and urinate upon it. We saw this with our own eyes. Sometimes in Guantanamo, you'd come back from your interrogation and found that your Quran, if you had one, has got boot prints in it, or spit marks upon it, or swear words written in it, because they knew the Quran was, for us, the most important thing. But even that backfired on them, because we organized a return of the Qurans to all the Americans and said, we don't want it. If you're going to use it as an excuse to desecrate the Quran, we will learn ourselves. And indeed, many people learned the Quran the old original way, which was by word of mouth. What those who knew taught those who didn't know. And again, that was part of our resistance. So I read this book, and this book is called Servants of Allah. And it's about Africans who were enslaved by the Americans in the 1800s and beyond. And I started to resonate with some of the things that happened here, because the last time that the Americans took people from the Muslim world in chains across the Atlantic was slavery. And the next time was us in Guantanamo. So there's a parallel there. And I read in this book that many Muslims from West Africa who were enslaved were taken to the Americans. And they tried their best to hold on to the Islamic principle, to all of the 5 pillars. So over years, their understanding of the Shahada, the pronunciation of the Shahada started to change, because from the beginning to the last generations, there were very few people who could teach the Salah.
So now you've come out of Guantanamo, and years later, again, unfortunately, you find yourself in Belmarsh. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so in 2011 and 12, I'd gone to Syria when the Arab Spring had begun. I'd gone to all of the Arab countries, actually, the North Arab African countries, to Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, and I was doing my investigations of the role of the British government and the Americans in rendition of suspects to these countries that were known to practice torture. And indeed, I went to Syria for the same thing. And when I was there for a short period of time, I met a lot of the Syrian rebels who were fighting against the regime, had some connection with them, tried to meet with those who had been part of the renditions program. When I returned, I think about after a year after I had returned, my passport was removed. It was confiscated by the state. And then about a couple of months later, I was arrested. It was about 150 officers raided my home on the charge that I was providing fitness training to the rebels and that I'd sent a generator. I remained in prison for about seven months as a Category A prisoner in solitary confinement in Belmarsh until my case was about to go to court. Just before it did, the government threw in the towel. They didn't want to go to court and declared me not guilty, and then the police declared me innocent. But as a result of that, it was kind of a new phase for me. I had bank accounts closed. My passport was taken eventually. I got it back after 10 years, but I used to get stopped all the time. So there was a different phase of the state being targeted by the state. And part of it, I believe, was because I was uncovering the role that the British government had and the Americans had in the renditions program, handing people over to Bashar al-Assad, handing people over to Gaddafi, handing people over to Tunisia and Egypt, and their role in the torture program. But alhamdulillah, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's grace, all of that in the end has made me far, far stronger than I was even before I went into Belmarsh, let alone Guantanamo.
So what led you to go into Guantanamo? Why did they deem you to be this?
Well, I didn't go to Guantanamo out of choice. In 2001, I was living in Afghanistan with my wife and children. We were working on building a school for girls. At the time, the Taliban were in power. When the 9/11 attacks began, I evacuated to Pakistan, where I had family and friends. And on the 31st of January 2002, there was a knock on my door. I opened the door, and there were a group of unnamed, unidentified Pakistani and CIA agents who stormed in, tied my hands behind my back, shackled my legs, put a hood over my head in front of my family, and carried me away into darkness for the next 3 years. I remained in Guantanamo for 3 years, Guantanamo, Bagram, and Kandahar for 3 years without charge or trial. I was released in 2005, came home. I sued the British government for their role in my torture. I won a large compensation alongside others, and have since been holding the government to account for its role in the torture program, as well as those who have been participating in complicity with the Americans in the invasion of Iraq, of Afghanistan, the torture program. I've since been back to Afghanistan, to the very house where I lived in, to the very prison where I was held in Bagram. And those who were held with me from the Taliban, who were beaten, stripped naked, tortured and abused, are now senior members of their government. And that has been the result of 20 years of the war on terror.
So are you continuing your work now? And are you in any way afraid that you might be targeted again by the state?
Do I look afraid?
Not at all. Not at all.
No. I've continued my work and continue to do so. As I said, I've been back now to Afghanistan, of all places, and fighting for the cases of those who are still held in prison in Guantanamo from around the world, including the Afghans. The state doesn't frighten me. When the state said it's watching me, I look it right back in the eyes and say, I'm watching you right back. And so why should they frighten me? Why should I be afraid of them? I've done nothing wrong.
What advice can you firstly give people to be as strong as you, and any advice you can give viewers at home who'd like to perform Hajj?
I'd say take a look at Palestine. Take a look at what's happening there. If you want to see strength in people, if you want to see the strength of the children, if you want to see the strength of the women and the men and the people who've gone through, there's a beautiful hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا حَبَّ اللَّهُ قَوْمًا فَابْتَلَاهُمْ. When Allah loves a people, He tests them. Nobody's been tested as much as the Palestinians. In Guantanamo, the entire torture program was developed for a Palestinian called Abu Zubaydah Zain al-Abidin Muhammad Hussein. He's been held there without charge or trial for 22 years. He's a Palestinian. And the entire torture program was developed for him. So when I take a look at Guantanamo or take a look at the Palestinians, I see one situation where people are tested, they are oppressed and targeted, and yet you see people from across the world, including many non-Muslims, who have put aside all your famous du'at, or those who are calling people to Islam through arguments and debates and so forth. Just take a Palestinian child who recites the Quran while a member of a limb of his body is being amputated because there's no anesthetic. Take a look at that child and see his inspiration far stronger than any of these great speakers around the world, because he will tell you and teach you through action what nothing can be taught you through word. And so my advice is, people look to the people of Palestine. The Prophet ﷺ said, إِذَا فَسَدَ أَهْلَ الشَّامِ فَلَا خَيْرَ فِيكُمْ. If the people of this region have become corrupted, there's no good left in you. So as long as there's people good there, there'll be good left in us.